Have you ever considered what books would be your life? If you started, what was the first book that made any influence? And were there any books that had an impact on you at any significant points in your life? I look back over my 60 years and there are quite a few books, and I still carry a number of books around with me. The first book that I feel was significant was by A.A. Milne, and it wasn't actually Winnie the Pooh. It was Now We Are Six. Have you heard of it? So Now We Are Six is a collection of poems by A.A. Milne. And the one poem that I particularly liked was about a bear. And it goes like this. If I were a bear, and a big bear too, I shouldn't much care if it froze or snew. I shouldn't much mind if it snowed or frizz. I'd be all fur-lined with a coat like his. For I'd have fur boots and a brown fur wrap, and brown fur knickers, and a big fur cap. I'd have a fur muffle ruff to cover my jaws, and brown fur mittens on my big brown paws. With a big brown furry down up to my head, I'd sleep all the winter in my big fur bed. And this story is essentially Winnie the Pooh probably thinking about hibernation and enjoying being wrapped up beautifully warm. I may have mentioned before that I do have a bit of a passion for horses, and I certainly did when I was younger. I would spend a lot of time hanging around horses, trying to go out on rides and walking around the village to borrow people's horses. And one of the books that I managed to get hold of a copy of again was about a horse called Timber. And I always loved the fact that Timber was this chestnut gelding. And years later, just after I'd had my daughter, I went to Wellington riding, and they had a horse there, and he was called Timber, and I was so chuffed. Because it brought back so many memories of wanting to ride a horse called Timber, and I got to ride Timber. He was my regular companion in the riding club events, and we did a couple of dressage tests together, and we were getting better and better, working together very well, which was lovely. And the next book that I found some information on, which was handed to me, and this was before my daughter was born, by my first husband, was Bridge Over Forever by Richard Bach. Now, he gave me this book and said to me, read it, this is how I feel about you. So I'm going to read you the synopsis. Did you ever feel that you were missing someone you had never met? Haunted by the ghost of a wise, mystical, lovely lady who lives just around the corner in time, Richard Bach begins his quest to find her, to learn of love and immortality, not in the hereafter, but in the here and now. Yet caught in storms of wealth and success, disaster and betrayal, he abandons the search, and the walls he builds for protection become his prison. And then he meets the one brilliant and beautiful woman who can set him free, and with her begins a transforming journey, a magical discovery of love and joy. Now, can you imagine? I was 21 and I was presented with poetry and letters and this book to read. And I had grown up on some Georgette Heyer romance. You can imagine Georgian romances. I was hook, line and sinker, fell for that one. And yes, we got married. So that actually takes me back to some other books. I'm going out of chronological order, which is going to confuse the hell out of me, and thinking, where did I go with that one? Georgette Heyer. Have you heard of her? I used to go to the library and get her books out. Now, she was a prolific author and she was writing for quite some time. And she's written as a short story writer in both Regency romance and detective fiction. I don't recall reading any of her detective fiction, but the Regency romances, they were definitely of a style and they followed a particular pattern. And you can just imagine. So apparently she wrote her first ones in 1935, which was Regency Buck, and her best-selling one was named with the Regency romances. She particularly liked the Duke of Wellington, and she talked about him in some of her books. So there was an element of bringing his romance into things. Someone else said that her Regency romances were inspired by the writings of Jane Austen, and I don't think Jane Austen was too popular when I was a teenager. And then I had a think about who else was I reading then, because I definitely did work my way through. Can you remember, was she called Virginia Andrews? And she wrote The Flowers in the Attic. I'm quite sure I should not have been reading that book as a teenager. It certainly was a strange book of its time. What books do you recall reading when you were a teenager? I could probably have got through the full selection of books from the library. I was reading a lot of library books, probably not focusing on my studies. That was certainly a theme of the day. And I remember reading in my bed with a torch, hiding under the duvet so I could continue reading because I didn't want to go to sleep. And that was a habit that I started quite early on when I was at boarding school, when I would be reading some Winnie the Pooh, or I was reading about Farewell, you know, those naughty ponies. And I had a Farewell pony as well. Not that that was a book. Now I have lots of books all over the place. So I probably could go on about my favourite books, but what I would like you to do is to let me know, what is your favourite book that you remember and that had some significance to you? Maybe it was Black Beauty. I think everybody read Black Beauty, didn't they? Especially the horsey girls. But what other books formed part of who you are today? And I might actually do this as a list and go see if I can actually remember any other any other books. And because I've got a book, an author's name, is it Wilbur Smith? And I remember reading most of his, and he was quite an interesting author because he used to go into a lot of detail, even down to how someone would go into a boxing fight. Now I can't remember the name of which particular book that was, but the guy was a southpaw. He was left-handed, and so that does have some advantages when you're boxing, apparently. Anyway, let me know what books influenced you or had an impact on you when you were young, or maybe later on in life. Maybe you were a late starter with books. I would love to know. And if you want to come and chat about any of the books that are important to you, then you can always contact me, comment below, or email info@thedandelion.co.uk. And have a marvellous magical evening. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cauldron of Curiosities. If you enjoyed this dip into folklore, don't forget to follow the podcast, share it with a friend, and keep your lantern handy for the next curious tale.